I am so full right now, not of food, of life, coming off of that incredible experience we just had for 5.5 days. And I'm so grateful that you got to be a part of it. So I reached out to you. I thought it was slim chance that you would answer because I figured you were incredibly inundated with so many people reaching out. And I got to give a shout out to Mark Gober for giving me your contact info and said, hey, I have this festival that I'm putting on called Confluence. I would love for you to come speak. And you responded. You showed up. You absolutely crushed your talk at Confluence. It was titled Autism in the Akashic Records, right? And it was mind-blowing on so many levels, and also so cool because it related to so many of the other topics that were discussed by Gerald Pollack, Ian McCusick, Veda Austin, so many other people at Confluence, and it was just such a beautiful experience. So thank you for being a part of that, and thank you for being here in my studio with me right now. I've been looking forward to this ever since I heard you on Telepathy tapes, and I'm just so grateful that you're here.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure.
Yeah. Okay, I think the most appropriate place to start is just a relatively brief summary of how you became interested in ESP and psychic phenomena.
It really goes back to when I was at Harvard, and I was asked as the psychiatrist who consulted to medical and surgical floors to see a patient whom the staff thought was mentally ill, and she wanted to leave the hospital against medical advice. And you can't do that if you're mentally ill. They think, well, you're irrational. You can't make those decisions. And when I went in to see her, she said to me, the first thing she said was, I'm seeing ghosts here, and it's really just too much for me. I've got to go. And the second thing she said was, and I'm psychic. I just know my tests are going to come back normal. So there's no reason for me to stay. You have nothing to worry about. And in my training as a psychiatrist, we're told that people who say things like that are definitely mentally ill. If somebody claims that they can predict the future or read minds or see ghosts, it's a sign that they have some kind of, back then people talked about a chemical imbalance and that they need to be on an antipsychotic, and they're certainly not in touch with reality. That's what psychosis means, is that you're not in touch with reality, a consensual reality. And it's just not my style to go in and have somebody tell me something like that and then to just go and sign the paperwork, which I could have done, but instead I thought, no, I really want to have a conversation with you and talk with you and see if I can get you to understand why I'd love for you to stay and to find out more about this person. I really wanted to just do my own assessment, because people can become psychotic as a result of a medical illness.
Mm.
And, nutritional deficiencies, people in alcohol withdrawal can have hallucinations, so there's just a whole host of things that can cause people to have that. And so I'm sitting down with her, and literally within the first few minutes, she says to me, I see this white light over you. It's kind of like Jesus's light. And I'm like, okay, that's interesting. And at the time I'd never heard of auras. But I'd heard of halos. I thought, oh, that's interesting. She sees halos. Okay, she likes me. And then the second thing she said is, and I'm getting a reading about you. Do you mind if I tell you about what I'm seeing? She said, I'm not a professional psychic. I just have this gift. I was born with the caul over my face, which is when the afterbirth is
the amniotic sac.
The amniotic sac.
My son was just born that way, so it's probably reading us right now.
And the amniotic sac adheres to the face, and so I thought that's interesting. And she was half Native American and half African American, and I said, okay, well, if you're getting a reading on me, sure, tell me what you see. And she said, well, your husband's a chemist. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. She should pick that of all things to say, because my husband and I were medical students together, and he didn't just get an MD, he also got a PhD in biochemistry.
Wow.
And then the next thing she says is, and he's applying for a job in 2 different cities right now. And that very week, he was getting ready to fly out he was applying for a postdoctorate in biochemistry. And he had applied at 2 programs, one back at Johns Hopkins where we met, and the other program at the University of California, San Diego. And now she really has my interest. And I said, oh, really? Okay. So he's applying for a job in 2 different cities, really? And I didn't want to let on. I just said, well, tell me what cities
You didn't
those
confirm.
are.
Yeah, you didn't confirm.
I didn't confirm. Because I'm a scientist.
Mhm.
I'm not just a clinician. I'm a scientist. I'm a theoretician, and have done a lot of, I used to do laboratory work in neuroscience, and molecular biology, actually. So I said, well, so what cities are those? And she said, well, name some cities and I'll tell you the one you'll end up in. And the one you end up in is actually the one that your husband in his heart of hearts doesn't want to go to. And I knew in my husband's heart of hearts, he really wanted to go back to Johns Hopkins. He was somebody who had always lived on the East Coast. He was 13th generation Baltimorean. He was even born at Johns Hopkins. A great uncle of his was an anesthesiologist there. I mean, he had a cousin who was at Johns Hopkins who actually went on to get a Nobel Prize in chemistry, Peter Agri, who discovered the channel for water, that we actually have a receptor in the cell membrane for transporting water. So anyway, so that's his background. I knew that's where he wanted to go back to. And I had already been offered a faculty position there. And the other place was San Diego. And he always thought of California as, the land of the, nuts and fruits, just a place where people have all these kinky ideas and they dress weird and everything. And, he was...
Nuts and fruits quite literally, and then also like as it applies to people, right?
Right, literally and figuratively. Yeah. And so I said, well, I named off a bunch of cities, 10 or 12 cities. And she says, San Diego, that's where you end up. She says, and when you get there, you'll be very, very successful, and you'll only have one child, and it'll be a daughter, which did come true, both of those things. I was very, very successful, had a daughter. And then she said, and then you'll eventually leave psychiatry to write books. And I was somebody who had always had this interest in writing books. I enjoyed creative fiction. And in fact, in addition to taking science, I took a lot of comparative literature when I was in college. So I was just like, well, that's really, really interesting. And that was when people hear about my research, they say, when did you undergo ontological shock? When did you have your world turned upside down? Well, that's when I had my world turned upside down. And this was back in 1989, a long time ago. And I said to her, wow, I said, okay. I said, well, I'm going to have a hard time convincing the staff that you're not mentally ill because they already have their mind made up. She said, I really like you. If you agree to see me tomorrow, I'll stay the night. And so that's what I did. Her test came back normal, and she left the next day. And I just didn't know what to do with that information. And each time that one of those predictions came true, we ended up in San Diego. I only had one child. I really wanted to have 2, had a daughter. I've recently left psychiatry to write books. And it's like, how does that work? Now, one of the things that enabled me to accept that and not get so bent out of shape is that at the time that I was doing neuroscience research, it was so early on, neuroscience wasn't even a major. So, technically my major is in psychology, but I took biophysics, I did physiological psychology, comparative psychology, where you're studying the anatomy of brains of different species and the behavioral and cognitive differences in them, and seeing, what differences there are in the brain. So I thought, wow, okay, neuroscience is such a new field, and it really hasn't been able to explain anything yet. I mean, it's assumed that the brain is what creates consciousness, but people don't even know what consciousness is. I mean, it's really hard to. I knew about the hard problem without it being labeled the hard problem by David Chalmers, the Australian philosopher. And so I thought, well, okay, nothing in neuroscience says this is impossible. And then I also, because I was gifted in math and physics, and a lot of people thought I was going to become a physicist, and I have a brother who's actually a theoretical physicist, I was already aware of the revolution that had occurred in physics, in the early 1900s with Einstein's theory of relativity saying to us that our theory of time, our experience of time is an illusion. That we treat it as a half dimension. That it only moves in one direction, like an arrow. And I also knew that in quantum mechanics, that this concept that of the reality of the universe was also not what we thought, that we think of things as being solid that are really predominantly space. And so, and that we live in all of these waveforms.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, information can be carried in a wave. I mean, so I thought, well, this is a clue. This is a clue that we shouldn't ignore. And over the years, when I had time, I started looking into, I mean, has anybody, have other people had this experience? I discovered, all across the world, all different cultures throughout time, people have reported these sorts of things. So if something is true, it's just going to keep rearing its head, no matter how much you try to suppress it.
Right.
And I also understood that how important this was, because first of all, how can we have a model to try to understand the brain and consciousness if we just conveniently ignore everything that goes against the model we have? That's really not how science moves forward.
That's what mainstream science seems to do in many ways, but that's a whole nother topic. Like, come up with an idea of what might be, create a model around it, and try to fit everything into that model, even if there are glaring issues foundationally with that model. I talked about that with Gerald Pollack on the last episode, though, so we don't necessarily need to get into that. I know you share the same sentiments. So
yeah, well, I mean, where I went to medical school, Johns Hopkins, it's the toughest medical school there is. And a high percentage of the people in my class went there with the intention of becoming academic doctors who would advance theory within science. I mean, the person who was teaching neuroscience to me as a medical student was Vernon Mountcastle. He's the person who mapped out the visual cortex in chimpanzee. I had Ham Smith, who received a Nobel Prize for his work, teaching me microbiology and leaning over, my shoulder when I'm looking at a microscope. I had Saul Snyder, who was campaigning for the Nobel Prize at the time because of his work on endogenous, peptides and their behavioral cognitive effects, which is another thing that I had studied prior to going to medical school. So I mean, it was just superstar after superstar. And I was told in medical school that half of what we teach you today is going to be obsolete by the time you finish your career. And your job is to make it obsolete.
Wow.
And so I really saw it as, this is me just doing what I'm supposed to do.
Right.
I really was not aware that it would be so threatening to people to be challenging the paradigm, because that's just not the world I came from. My father was a scientist. He he had graduate degrees in marine biology, genetics, and physiology. And my earliest memories are at Hanford, where he was doing research on plutonium, and it's his work that helped to end nuclear testing in the West. Then he went on to become postdoctorate in cardiovascular physiology at the University of Washington, and then went on to teach medical students in universities and to develop parts for an artificial heart, and became the head of the artificial heart program at Battelle Memorial Institute in Columbus. And so he was just this brilliant scientist and mathematician. And he had said to me when I was in 7th grade, he said, "Oh, I want to see what they're teaching you, and I want to see what they're teaching in your science class." And so I hand him my science book, and he's looking at it, and he goes, "It says in here that the frog has a 4-chamber heart." He says, "That's incorrect. It's got a 3-chamber heart." Now, if anybody's going to know how many chambers of heart a frog has, it's going to be my father. You know, my father, I saw my father dissecting animals in the basement. He had a laboratory there. And so I was put in a dilemma when I was taking my test in 7th grade, and the science teacher had this multiple choice question there. You know, how many chambers does a heart have? I was like, well, my dad had said to me, "Don't believe everything you read, and that book is wrong on this." And I was like, well, do I provide the answer I know the teacher expects me to put down, or do I put down what I know is the truth? And I was like, I've got to put down the truth. And I'm somebody that, I loved, I usually got hundreds on my tests, but I was just like, I just can't put down something that is not true. And I think that was a real gift that my father gave me, because he taught me that it's sort of like that kind of trust but verify. Don't believe everything you hear or read, but if you see that it makes sense, that if it's your direct observation, et cetera, then you know that it's true. But but don't just think it's true because you read it somewhere. And so that was my father was a revolutionary scientist, and I went to the school to become, somebody who made a contribution. But I always thought that I didn't think that I was going to be in a position to do what I've been doing now. I mean, I was just thinking I was going to make some,
revolutionize the world?
I really just thought I'd be, contributing, along with,
no big deal.
I'm not somebody who had this like ego about, about me or whatever.
But that's what makes you great, though. That's why you're in this position now, though, Diane. That's why. You're the perfect person for it. For real.
Well,
that's why. I mean, I've gotten to know you over the last, we've been together for like a week now, hanging out. Like, you're the perfect person for that. You fit right in with our community. It's amazing, as you already know.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I really, but my agenda is only to be a truth teller. And I'm somebody who can do what people call mid-course correction. Okay,
Yeah.
If I think that I'm moving in the wrong direction, I can change my mind on that quickly. If I see things that say, "Oh no, that's wrong," but I'm also somebody who uses intuition along with my analytical skills. I'm really fairly balanced between my two ways. Some people simplistically call it the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere.
Right. So you're on this journey, and all these predictions that were given you by this woman are coming true, and they're all incredibly specific too. So at what point did you make the shift from doing what you were doing to, no, I need to study this full time. This needs to be my endeavor in the world?
Well, it was another epiphany when I was living in San Diego, and I was always trying to figure out, how do I crack the code in terms of, how consciousness relates to the brain. And so as I said, as an undergraduate, one of the things I did was I would look at, like the brain of it. And when I say look at it, I'm not the one actually going and dissecting the animal, looking at it. I mean, we had, that information available, but looking at the behavioral data
Got it.
of animals. And so I was trying to create that link. And one of the things I discovered during the early 90s, at a time when it was really politically incorrect to say that men and women were different from one another. And you had these women who were raising their children with, giving their daughters trucks and maybe even guns or, toy guns or whatever, and giving their sons dolls and whatnot. And for the most part, the girls were like, no, I'm interested in that doll. And the boys were like, I like this truck, vroom, vroom, vroom. And so my generation was starting to wake up to, well, we've been told this, and this is what we want to believe. We don't want to program our kids to be something other than who they are. So they're trying to create the conditions in which the children, can just be who they are without sort of putting it on them. And what I was seeing was these innate differences in childhood. And then when I was at Harvard, I became colleagues with some of the people at the Stone Center, which is the center that's in Wellesley, that was created by these women who were psychologists who discovered when they were reading the textbooks in psychology that it didn't describe them. That's not the way that I am. And in fact, some of it was pathologizing women. And because we really do operate out of a different sort of just a different way of being.
Yes.
And
you're saying like relative to men specifically.
Yeah. And it's not that one's better than the other.
Absolutely.
There's just some differences. And there's this woman who wrote a book about You Just Don't Understand, Deborah Tannen, and you're talking about how men and women use the same language, and yet we miscommunicate all the time because we assume we mean the same thing by the same words, or that we're different in our language. And it was such an aha moment for me when I read that, because the classic difference between men and women is that women really, really like to connect with others by talking. And it's what we call rapport talk, that you're just building a rapport. And it doesn't matter what you're saying as much as that, because you're tuning in more to what's the tone of this person's voice,
what's underneath the words.
What's underneath the words, and men are more about rapport talk. Like, well, I already knew that. Why are you telling me that? And so, at the end of the day, the man comes home, after working, and the wife will say to him, how was your day? And he'll say, fine. And you're like, is that it? You're not going to tell me anything more? What, don't you love me? Don't you want to connect with me? It's like, no, it's just fine. I don't know what else to say. It was fine.
Right.
So anyway, I knew that there were these differences. And I also knew from being a neuroscientist that there was this research that had been done on, rats and, other species showing anatomical differences between the brain. And I thought, looking at gender differences in behavior in animals and looking at gender differences in the anatomy of the brain between men and women, and looking at, because I had also done genetics and molecular biology, looking at those differences, trying to figure out what is the basis behind these differences between men and women. And I taught an upper division course at UCSD on that. I was asked by the chairman of the Department of Women's Studies to teach a course about it, because she had heard me lecture about it in the talk circuit. At the time, I was the head of a program for women who had been abused. And she said, I'd really love you to teach a course on this. And I said, okay, I'll teach a course on it. And while teaching that course, I had a professor of anthropology sit in on it. And then I also was getting into conversations with other faculty members at UCSD. And they're like, this is so brilliant what you're doing, Diane. We want to invite you to be part of a think tank on consciousness that meets at the Salk Institute.
Wow.
The and so I'm sitting there. This is a long answer to your question.
No, this is great. This is great. Because it's filtering in, like you have this direct experience with this woman, and then you're now being led more towards consciousness. So this is good.
Yeah, and so I'm in this think tank with there were 3 or 4 Nobel laureates there. Fred Gage was in it, who was the editor of I think it was Science. It was one, he was the editor of one of those major prestigious journals. And I'm sitting there, and in their conversation about trying to understand human consciousness, it sounded so granular, their approach. Okay. They said, well, we'll figure out human consciousness if we can discover the genetic, what is the gene or genes that differentiates a chimpanzee from a human? And I'm like, wow, okay, if that's what we're all here to talk about, I just was like, I don't think, just like the reason why I left academia was that I just saw that the conversation was too confining. It was like I didn't see any way that I could really ask the kinds of questions and pursue the things that I wanted. And I thought, no, I'm going to have to just kind of do this on my own. I'm not going to be able to do this within academia. And even the greatest minds, these people who are in positions where they're supposed to be. If anybody can be a free thinker, it should be people who have that kind of stature that these people had. And here I am. I'm a woman in my 30s, surrounded by these people who are older than me, more established,
right.
and I'm shy and I'm introverted, right. And I'm like, okay. So that's what then caused me to just go, well, I'll go into private practice, and I'll study this stuff on the side. And the deeper I dove into it, the more I realized that, boy, there's all this research out there that's been done in parapsychology that because it's only published in parapsychology journals, because there's the censorship in mainstream journals, then mainstream scientists are not even aware of it.
Right.
And so you just have it, kept in this little turnstile where only the people that already, are in the field are aware of it. And they cite each other's research, but it never gets out of that into the larger conversation.
Real quick question on that with your decision to sort of leave and go venture into this on your own. Was it largely because you both felt limited in that, this is just one example, they're looking into the genetic differences, right? Like if we can just find the gene that makes us different than a chimpanzee, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they're looking for a physical mechanism with respect to this. And it was also that because they're zooming in at such a granular level, when this really necessitates that, okay, before we zoom in and just look at specifically genetics here, presupposing that is the cause of this, we need to really zoom out and figure this out at all angles.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I just already knew that, and that's part of what I mean by my intuition guiding my path as a scientist. I was just like, okay, let's say we find some genes different. Like, then what? Right. Okay, the genes code for proteins. And then what? Right. I was like, I don't understand this. This conversation doesn't make sense to me.
Right.
And so, I felt really validated, vindicated, whatever you want to call it, when the Human Genome Project was complete. And they discovered, the human genome only has like 22,000 genes. And the difference between us and a chimpanzee is only like 1.5%. I was like, you can, that it just didn't make sense. on any level that we were going to have an understanding. And meanwhile, they were labeling, the rest of the chromosome as just junk DNA. And I knew from everything that I had studied within the biological sciences that nature is incredibly efficient. Yeah. It finds a way to use something in more than one capacity.
Right.
And it's just so brilliant in its design that it's tremendous hubris as humans to think that we could ever do anything better than what's already there. And that's one of the reasons why I was so attracted to the biological sciences rather than something like engineering.
That makes sense. So then you step away, you're doing this on your own. And what was the next experience you had in coming across someone, or was it something like a paper or something like that led you to like really, really deeply venture into this?
Well, I think that what really changes us is experiential. Mm-hmm. Yeah, very few people are changed just by reading a paper. And there were people who were influenced by my book, The ESP Enigma, because it goes into some of the things I've talked about in terms of, neuroscience has an incomplete model. There is evidence for this. Goes into physics and how, physics kind of gives us another sense of reality. But it's not so much that it makes a good case for it. But it's the fact that for a lot of people, it gave them permission. It took away the, just that sense of, well, am I crazy to even think this?
Right.
Or it's like, well, wait a minute. We people may label it impossible, but based on what? There's no there.
Right.
And so it's more like removing the hindrance to a belief rather than instilling a belief. Yeah. And then what you have is a lot of people, if they reflect back, that go, oh, well, gosh, I have this experience over and over, where my best friend and I just, we get busy signals when we call one another because we're thinking of each other at the same time. Or, there's the time that I just had the dream about my grandmother. And then that morning, when I wake up, my mom's got a sad face and says, oh, grandma died.
Yeah.
It's like, people start to go, well, this thing that I just shelled aside, because it's just like, well, you just think, well, that's just a coincidence. Yeah, right. just a coincidence. Don't make anything of it. And so what happened is that I thought back on, my youth. And I had this experience when I was around 13 or 14 years old where my brother's best friend was somebody who, as a teenager, traveled with the circus. And there was this magician that he worked with, and the magician was somebody who did Houdini-like tricks. Okay, he was one of those people who would get, chained up and then put into a tank of water. And then, it's like, well, he's going to die if he doesn't get out of that tank, in whatever it is, 10 minutes or whatever. Mm-hmm. And he manages to escape. And what Mark's job was is he's there with the hammer to break the glass in case something goes wrong. And so one day, Mark said to my brother and I, he said, Jay, his name was Jay Michelle, Jay's coming into town. You really need to meet him. I'm like, oh, yeah, that'd be great to meet him. So I go over to Mark's house and Jay says, I'm going to do a magic trick for you. I'm like, oh, okay, sure, what? He goes, well, go over to that bookshelf over there. And he said, pick any book you want. And there were, several hundred books there on that shelf. And I pick a book. And he says, now open it up to any page. And I'm standing across the room further than you are from me. And I open it up and he says, okay, I'm going to read it to you. And he starts reading it for me word for word while I'm reading it. I'm like, damn, and then he goes, pick another book. Did it with another book. I'm like, how'd you do that? He goes, oh, it's magic. It's just magic.
Just sleight of hand.
Just magic. And a magician never tells you his tricks.
Right.
So, and so, at that age, you're like, okay, it's a magician, he just tells you it's magic. But after having had that experience with this patient at Harvard, and then after seeing that there was all this research that had been done on psychic abilities and learning about things like remote viewing, I was like, well, wait a minute here. Yeah, he said it was magic, but what if it's really that he can do remote viewing or something like telepathy?
Wow. So let's get into some of the stuff that's featured in telepathy tapes now. What was your first experience with a nonverbal autistic kids? And correct me if I'm wrong, they like to refer to themselves as autists, right?
Yes.
Okay, so what was your first experience with that?
Well, so after writing my book, The ESP Enigma, I was invited to go to India by this woman who worked for the government with children who had disabilities. Mm-hmm. And she had read my book, and several of the children she was working with, she said, were savants who had savant skills, but she said they were also psychic. And she wanted me to come over there to do a workshop based on my book and to meet these children, to evaluate them. And so this was back in 2012. And so I went over to India, and I met this boy named Vishal. And his mother said that he has knowledge of science and he'd never been exposed to it. And he was somebody who was able to type into a keyboard the answers to questions. And so, he was only like 5 years old at the time, maybe 6, just a little guy. And I said, okay, well, I asked him questions. I said, oh, well, what's Huntington's disease? And he typed that it was, where the brain starts declining in function, which is the case. It's one of the forms of dementia. And just ask him, I don't remember what all the things were that I asked him, but I asked him these different questions. I had him do some math, et cetera. And I thought, wow, okay, he does have, this ability to know this. And that's a known thing among savants. I mean, that there's been these, reports of kids, for example. There was one back in the early 1800s of this boy who had never been to school, never had been taught arithmetic, never had been taught, how to read or write. And one day, when he was also around 5 or 6 years old, he's in the field with his father, and he just starts spouting out these mathematical formulas and solving them. Mm. And the father actually took him around on kind of like a circuit, he was, because people wanted to see this sort of wonder boy. And so I was always fascinated by these cases, that they somehow know information they shouldn't know. I mean, that's what savant comes from, the Latin term savoir, which means to know. And yet they know these stuff, and yet to look at them, it's like, they barely can, tie their shoes or whatever. So, they're thought of as being disabled in some significant way. Yeah. And yet then they have this like superpower. And so I'm evaluating him for that, and I'm really interested in that. And then there was another girl I evaluated who could put together a 1,000-piece puzzle that was all the same exact color. And she could do it in a matter of, a total of 70 to 100 hours. I mean, I don't know that I could even do it if you gave me till the end of time, because I can solve a 1,000-piece puzzle, but I use just the little, the difference in color,
Right.
a little bit of the pattern, trying to match it up. I mean, it's like all of these different things I need, but when they're all just solid silver.
Right. No, that's incredible.
And then there was another boy who the mother said, well, his superpower is that I can't hide anything from him. If he says, Mom, I want some more chips, and I say, I don't have any chips left, he'll be, yeah, you do. And I know where they are. You can't keep from the kid what the gift is going to be,
Right.
and so it was when I was over there that the woman, Maithili, who had invited me over, she said, oh, by the way, they're all telepathic too. And I thought, wow, okay, if they're telepathic with one another. And I'm like, oh, but I didn't have, this was something said to me right as I'm getting ready to leave, and I didn't have time to test the telepathy claim. But to me, it's like, is that really that much more remarkable than these other things that I'm witnessing and having described me? And I met this other psychiatrist who was in India, and he was telling me about this boy who, he told me the story where there was this woman who was with him, and the boy went and touched her breast, and the doctor said, please don't be offended, ma'am. He has this impulse to touch people if they have disease somewhere. I really suggest you get a mammogram. She went and got a mammogram, and it turned out she did have breast cancer. So that boy, saved this woman's life. So that's what I witnessed in India. And their culture there has, many of these people are Hindus. There's something called siddhis, which are these advanced abilities. And so for them, it's like there's no prohibition
revered.
It's revered. And it's viewed as a sign of, more evolved consciousness. There's no prohibition. There's no like, oh, this person's crazy, put them on drugs. And so I come back to the States, and I said, I'm being interviewed on podcasts, and I start just putting it out there that now I'm hearing claims of telepathy, which is something that hadn't been really reported as a savant skill as far as I knew. And shortly after that, I received an email from this father of a non-speaking girl who was in Wisconsin, who was only about 9 or 10 at the time, saying, I heard about your work from Daryl Trefford, who is known for his work on Rain. He was the expert on savant syndrome who was consulted to the movie Rain Man. And he said, so I hear that you're researching telepathy, and my daughter can read minds. And this girl had been thought by the father, who knew Daryl Trefford, was thought to be a mathematical savant, because here she was working with her therapist to do her math homework. And she just seemed like her math knowledge was limitless. I mean, she could, give you cube numbers of, multi-digit numbers and, all kinds of things. And then one day her calculator dies, and she has to switch to using her iPad to do the calculation. And it gives the calculation an exponential logarithmic notation rather than the usual way. And so then Haley types it out in logarithmic notation. And the therapist is like, well, wait a minute. Because the calculator is outside of Haley's eyesight. She goes, wait a minute. She says, how'd you do that? And Haley types, I see the numerators and denominators in your head. And she goes, really? She goes, what am I thinking right now? And Haley typed, you're thinking about Barney the dinosaur? And she goes, yeah. She goes, what's the name of my landlord? And she types Helmet. And she goes, whoa, okay. She's like, this kid's reading my mind. And she didn't know what to do with it. She was afraid to tell the parents. And then subsequently, this other therapist starts working with Haley because the first therapist was also the mother to a young child, so she wasn't able to be there, full time. And the second therapist is working with Haley, and the therapist notices that Haley makes the same kind of spelling mistakes she makes in her typing. And she says, "Oh, that's so," she was just joking. She said, "Oh, that's so funny. It's like you're reading my mind. You make the same mistakes as me." And Haley's like, "I do read your mind."
Wow.
And she said, "Well, how do you say 'I love you' in German?" Because this woman was raised bilingually, and she types out the German for "I love you." And this is a girl who had no exposure to German. She was being homeschooled in her house. Her parents were they were not of German extraction. I mean, and so then what happened is that therapist was like, "Well, what am I going to do with this?" And eventually both therapists told the parents, who at first were shocked, but then they did their own experiments. They're like, "Oh my gosh, what do we do this?" They asked Daryl Trefford about it. Daryl Trefford said, "Well, there's this other psychiatrist who's doing research, who wants to do research on telepathy, who's also been studying savants, and contact her." And that's what led me to do my initial experiments on telepathy with her.
So where did you begin with those experiments?
Where did I begin?
Yeah, like where do you begin with that? Like, oh my goodness. I mean, so you're clearly opening up to all of this, given your initial experience, and like this is just life, God, whatever you want to call it, pulling you in this direction, and here you are. Where did you begin with these experiments? Like, what did you start doing?
Well, I mean, so the first thing that happened is that the parents sent me a DVD that showed one of their kind of homegrown experiments, and you see, this stack of these cards, okay, these like children cards, and they're face down and they're like mushed like this, okay, and then you see someone pick it up, show it to the therapist, okay, and then say, "Haley, what am I thinking, or what did I just see?" And Haley goes, "Dit, dit, 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 dit." And you see it's exactly what the card is. These are like cards for learning, learning words, learning colors. Like one of them's of a sun, and another one's of a star, and another one's of a kangaroo on a swing, or whatever. And she's typing it out accurately, card after card after card. And I thought, okay, so after watching the DVD, I thought this is really worth going to see. And so I met with the family by phone. I mean, this was before. I mean, Zoom was a real a thing like it is now. And I met with them, and I said that that's a really compelling video you sent me. And I said, I'd really like to come and test your daughter. And when I spoke with Dean Radin, whom I already knew, he's a well-known parapsychologist, chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and I told him about it, and he said, "Well, they've got to be in separate rooms." And so I said, "Well, can we get them in separate rooms, and you can start testing it that way before I come out?" And they said, "Well, that's going to really be hard for Haley because it'll make her anxious if she's, put in a different room, because these children, they suffer a lot of anxiety. I mean, that's one of the reasons why they engage in these sort of repetitive, compulsive activities. It's really hard for them to sit still, really hard for them to stay focused on something." And I said, "Well, is there a way you could put a visual barrier between Haley and the therapist?" And so they did. They put a visual barrier between the two, but the introduction of something new, is also enough to make these kids sometimes get dysregulated and whatnot. And so she regressed a little bit and went back to using the stencil board as her form of communication. But I had already seen, the evidence on this DVD of her doing it, where she's just typing it into something. She, her talker, which is like an iPad that has an electronic voice. So I knew that it wasn't an artifact of the stencil board. And so so I went there and I tested her in 3 different sets of experiments, which were 2 hours duration each, with the 2 different therapists, where one's on one side of the barrier and then Haley's on the other. And I was in another room and I had cameras mounted to cover the entire room. I had 5 cameras where I had a camera in front of them, cameras on either side, cameras behind. I had them both mic'd so that I could hear any kind of anything that was transmitted between them. I had digital clocks on both sides of the barrier so that, and time synced with the clock on the camera so that you could see there was no manipulation of the data, that in real time, this is what's going on. And then I used a random number generator to pick the numbers, because there's a certain preferred numbers that people will tend to, if you say, oh, pick a number, 1 out of 10, there's just certain numbers that people tend to gravitate to, just to cover all the variables that I could. So I used that. I used a random list generator to take the cards that I brought, picture cards that I had, and put them in order that, so they were totally randomized how they'd be presented. I created sentences, had those presented, and I would fed the information to the therapist to look at a couple of different ways. One way that I did it was to write it down on pieces of paper that she would, either give her the stack of cards or give her the numbers on a piece of paper, and then also fed the information through a text, from smartphone to smartphone, just trying it all these different ways. And she was 100% accurate most of the time. Some stretches 97% of the time, but then self-corrected to.
She'd get it wrong and then immediately after say, oh, actually.
She would self-correct it. And what you have to understand is that these children oftentimes, they have sensory motor issues. And so it's more like about their aim being poor rather than it being that they don't know what it is. And then once they make a mistake like that, they kind of freeze and they're like, how do I correct that? So anyway, but I captured all of this on video and then presented it at a scientific conference at the place I first presented. It was the Parapsychological Association's annual conference, and people were just blown away. I mean, people described it as jaw-dropping.
Yeah. Oh my goodness, it is jaw-dropping. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was back in, that was like back in 2013, 2014, back then.
Wow. I'd imagine like that was incredible to witness. And I'm sure that was just the starting point for some of the incredible things that you've witnessed these children do. Would you say that's correct?
I wouldn't say it was the starting point because of what I just told you I had experienced before.
Right. Well, yeah, good point.
Yeah. I mean, and what one has to understand is that this is how all happened for me over this period. There was the patient at Harvard.
Yeah.
But then there's me looking back at, this magician that I had met when I was just a teenager, and then realizing, boy, there's a lot of research that's been done on this stuff, and seeing Russell Targ's work in 1995 when it was first declassified, and being, and going, wow, those pictures, of the windmills look like, the windmills. And so at this point, it's like, it's obvious to me that that people, for reasons we don't understand, are able to access information that's non-local.
Yeah.
And so it just, once that nut is cracked open that you can access non-local information, it's like the rest of these things, they just don't have that same kind of, oh, and they can do that too. Whereas with people who listen to the telepathy tapes, they're getting it all like boom, 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 boom. I mean, that podcast was just like, weekly episodes, and you're having it happen. You're having the next thing presented to you when you haven't fully digested what you already heard the episode before.
That is 100% true. Right.
And so that's a different process, because that leaves people in a more of a stunned kind of like, well, what do I do with this kind of thing?
Yeah. Well, the world's ready for it right now. So let's get into the hill. When did you first come across that? I think it was mentioned in the telepathy tapes when you first came across it. But like, for me, that is the most incredible piece, one of the most incredible pieces of the telepathy tapes, is realizing there is a place, for lack of a better term, that these autists meet with each other to instantly communicate information, like a etheric, if you want to call it that, chat room or something like that. Mm-hmm. When did you first come across that, and how did you begin to approach demonstrating this empirically?
Well, so as I said earlier, that the first time I heard that these children were telepathic with one another was when I was in India. Mm-hmm. And Maithili told me that. The second time that I heard that they were telepathic with one another was this woman that I met in Southern California who has a non-speaking son, and she learned how to become an applied behavioral therapist to work with her own son, and she had created a school for children like her son. And that's when she discovered the telepathy. And she said, these kids are all telepathic with one another. And not only that, they know things that are going on in other parts of the world. They're experiencing these things. And so I'd already heard that from two totally independent sources that wouldn't know anything from one another. The first time I heard of the Hill was actually when I went to Atlanta and met John Paul in Houston for the first time. And both of them were, they'd go off into their room, and the mother said, well, what they're talking on the Hill, they like to, take a break in the middle of the day and just go and, talk with their buddies on the Hill. And, oh, what's the Hill about? Well, it's this place where they can all meet with one another. And so that's when I first heard about it. And the way they described it, sounded like the Akashic Records. I mean, it sounded like a play, like Edgar Cayce used to go into a trance and go someplace where he would just access information. Yeah. And so it became clear to me that it really is, it's not a physical location. It really is a non-physical reality. But when I first heard it, I thought, well, okay, they're telepathic with one another, and I thought it was just a cute nickname that the two of them gave it, the Hill. Mm-hmm. But then we found other children that, that the person says, oh, my kid goes to the Hill. And I was like, the Hill? You're talking about the Hill? Your kid said the Hill? Yeah, the kid actually said the Hill.
Wow.
And so that's when it, to me, became something more than just the nickname that these two kids gave it.
How many kids have you discovered of like these nonverbal kids have referred to it in that way at this point?
Well, it's a little bit, the waters are a bit muddied because, I would say that, at least two other independent sources beyond John Paul and Houston. The problem is that since the telepathy tapes is aired, it's like anybody who comes to me and say, yeah, my kid goes to the Hill too, and da-da-da, it's like all bets are off, as a scientist, right. I just
Now there's no way to verify that it is independent and not aware already by another source.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So but the fact that some other people who hadn't heard the telepathy tapes, the telepathy tapes hadn't even aired yet, referred to it as the Hill, makes me think, okay, that's a thing. But I had never heard of it before John Paul and Houston, and it may be that they just had, it may be that it just didn't get labeled that. It's kind of an interesting kind of nickname for it.
Yeah, it is. It's a really interesting nickname. One of the pieces from the telepathy tapes that, one of many pieces that stands out is Akil, who seems to share consciousness with his mother no matter where she is. I think that was his name? Am I saying that incorrectly?
Yeah. There's actually two Akils.
Oh, wow.
It's wild, the synchronicities that occur. There's two Mias, there's two Akils.
That is so interesting. That is so interesting.
Yeah.
But can you share with me some of the most mind-blowing things that these parents have said about their children's abilities?
Well, I think one of the things that I find really interesting is this child in the UK who's able to enter his mother's lucid dreams.
I think that was in episode 8 that was featured, right?
I don't keep track of which episode's which.
Got it. Yeah, I remember this.
Yeah, and I find that really fascinating. That in her dream, her son, shows her a card. It might have been the Jack of Spades or something like that, and then the next day, he shows her that card as though to say, "Yeah, that was me in your dream." And so what that suggests to me is really that that when we're in lucid dreaming state, and perhaps when we're in just a dreaming state in general, it doesn't have to necessarily be a lucid state, because a lot of people who don't typically experience psi phenomena can have a dream that that is precognitive or telepathic or any of those things. It suggests to me that think of it as having two basic operating systems. Okay, when one operating system is working, it's all sensory driven. Okay, it's what is the light bouncing off of and then entering my retina and then feeding my brain as to what is in front of me. What are the local vibrations that I interpret as sound. So all of the different senses, that is local information during our waking state, gets integrated into sort of the interface that we call reality. That this is what we think of as reality, and yet you have other people who, in their waking reality, they're not experiencing the same thing as us, and just because we don't just bump into one another, and that we still can somehow interact, doesn't mean that we're really having the same experience at the same time. And then the other sort of MO or operational system, whatever, is that which gets kicked on when we're in dreaming sleep, and that's where kind of anything can go. Dreams can be incredibly nonsensical, and we usually don't question it. It's oh, well, this person has, two heads. Well, it's I don't see that when I'm in my waking reality.
But when you're in the dream, it's it's totally normal too.
It's totally normal.
So weird.
It's why not? It's just and if you look at the brain activity of those two, they really are using the brain very differently. When we're in our waking reality, the left hemisphere is dominant, okay, and that's sort of the analytical, processing mode, okay, and the frontal lobes are active, They're what sort of set they help us to focus our attention, but they also set our, expectation. That's what enables us to think of consequences. And so, when people have the diagnosis of ADD, it's that they don't have as much activity in their frontal lobes. And so that's one of the reasons why they can be more impulsive and do things, because they're not thinking of the consequences. And all little kids are ADD. I mean, look at look at how distractible a little 4-year-old is,
Right.
I mean, it's like, you can use that to your benefit, but it also, in terms of, if they're like crying about the fact they dropped their ice cream cone, you can flip their mood. If you just say, "Hey, but look at this,"
Right.
and but it also means you have to watch them more, because they're not thinking about what could happen next. Well, anyway, so the frontal lobes shut down during dreaming sleep. Very active when we're in waking sleep, because we're there planning and going from step 1 to step 2 to step 3. And the right hemisphere is more active in dreaming sleep rather than the left hemisphere. And the right hemisphere is rather than the analytical thinking, it's more associated with Gestalt, holistic thinking. And so when I realized that the people who seem to report psi the most frequently, are people like in a dream state, but they don't have it during the waking state, or people that are like super artistic and creative, that are like, I'm really right-brained, or, I'm right-brained and I'm ADD, and they have these experiences. Their brains are operating, with this different operating system, even when they're interfacing, in the waking reality. And I thought, well, whose brain activity is more reminiscent of that in waking sleep? And that's what made me predict that if anybody could demonstrate these abilities, it would be autistic kids, because in children, the frontal lobes are still becoming myelinated, and the connections with the rest of the brain are still being, made, and so the frontal lobes are taken off, offline, and then you look at a lot of what skills are, that they're using things like pattern recognition and visual spatial recognition, right hemisphere skills. And where are their deficits? Their deficits are more we associate with left hemisphere, like language. And so I thought, well, and then savant syndrome is so similar to, psi abilities, that I thought, this is who I'd study. And then it turned out that, when I put that out there, that's when I started having people contact me saying, yeah, you're right.
Wow. I want to go back to this dream thing for a second, though, because to me, this would possibly imply that the dream realm, or when we experience dreaming, we are possibly in another realm that can be entered by other people if they have these advanced abilities. Is that kind of the position that you've come to as a possibility?
Yeah, obviously, we're entering into a realm that's not informed by our senses. We're entering into a realm that, I think of it as it's non-local.
Yeah. And that's what I mean by that too. And I just want to clarify for the audience, like, I'm not saying a realm within our mind. It depends on what you mean by our mind there. But I'm talking about literally, for lack of a better term, another place that our consciousness is able to access, that we, as we go about life, take to just mean, oh, this is a product of like our mind based on our imagination, blah, 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 subconscious stuff maybe. And maybe there is some truth to that, but I'm talking about like a literal realm, given that this individual, and I'm sure other individuals, are able to enter the dreams of their mother and meet them there and show them things that are then confirmed the next day in reality.
I think it becomes problematic. It's as you said before we started the interview, a lot of these things, it's hard to put into words.
Yes,
and
right.
and it's important to not let our words trap us into a
Yes.
way of thinking. And so when you talk about a realm, people think of a place.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's not how I conceptualize it.
Same. But like, what do we say,
Well, the way that I would, it's almost easier to put it in terms of a different frequency. So if you think of it as that, like I can have my radio, and this is just an analogy, but I can have my radio tuned to a certain frequency, and I'm getting this radio program, okay? I change the frequency, I'm getting another radio program. And when I was a kid, my dad had a German radio, which was, German radios are these big things that had channels where, here we were in the middle of, Hanford Reservation in the middle of nowhere, and yet he could pick up stations from Germany. He could pick up, Europe or whatever. And you have to realize this is back in the 50s, at a time, people may take it for granted now, but back then to me, that was like, a miracle that I could be listening to something that people, on the other side of the world could be listening to as well. And so, but until you tune into that frequency, that world doesn't exist for you. The world that you're experiencing is the one you're tuned into.
Yeah. So then it's like, in these states, these children are able to tune into the exact specific frequency that, his mother is in with respect to her own dream and literally enter into it.
Yeah. Exactly. It's, and it may be that people who are related to one another can tune into each other's frequency more easily because you share all of this DNA with one another. So you don't have to modify your frequency as much to tune into it, because it's more like a matching frequency.
Most healthcare today operates on an outdated mechanistic model, treating the body like a battlefield rather than a self-healing system. You wait months for an appointment only to receive a rush diagnosis that labels you rather than truly understanding your unique health. Even in holistic health, many practitioners rely on endless lab tests and supplement protocols, addressing symptoms instead of the root cause. And the result? Another prescription or supplement regimen that merely suppresses or masks symptoms rather than facilitating true healing, whether the imbalance was physical, emotional, energetic, or a mix of all three. And that's why Dr. Tom Cowan co-founded the New Biology Clinic, to offer something radically different. As one of the most respected natural health doctors in the world, Dr. Cowan has spent decades challenging conventional medicine and advancing a deeper understanding of human biology, water, and natural health. His work isn't just about rejecting the mainstream, it's about offering a more truthful, biologically coherent approach for healing. The New Biology Clinic recognizes that health isn't about fighting disease, it's about restoring balance. You're not a diagnosis, you're an individual with a unique story, and healing should honor that. With virtual consultations available worldwide, the clinic offers a flat-rate monthly membership that gives you direct access to practitioners who take the time to actually listen. Members also get exclusive health live streams, a resource library, and live sessions covering everything from biofield tuning and breathwork to movement and meditation, all designed to support whole body healing. And if you're not ready for a membership, you can book a one-time appointment, sign up for an enrichment-only membership for the healing modalities alone, or schedule a free connection session with one of the care team members to see how the New Biology Clinic can help in your specific situation. This isn't about keeping you dependent on doctors. It's about making you sovereign over your health. Head to newbiologyclinic.com and use code THEWAYFORWARD, and that's spelled The Way, F-O-R-W-A-R-D, for $50 off account activation, or just head to the show notes for more info. If you're a member of The Way Forward, email hello@thewayforward.com for $150 off. Your body already knows how to heal, and New Biology Clinic helps you remember. For me, I like to think of it in terms of the water, just the waters of our bodies, for lack of a better term, in the biofield. Like, given that I am an amalgamation of the waters from my mom and the waters from my dad coming together as one. And you have that spark of light when the sperm meets the egg. I'm sure you're familiar with that, like that initial spark of light that happens. That's, I think, and this is getting pretty esoteric, I have no way to validate this scientifically whatsoever, but that's like the initial point that the soul is entering into that being and that spark of light is created. And that is like our biofield starting to set in. And I think of the biofield as the soul within the context of a body. I think who we are as a soul is so much more expanded than that. You talk to people who have near-death experiences or who have these like transcendental states, whether it's through Qigong or some form of plant medicine or anything like this. And I've talked to several of them, and they all talk about how when they do enter back into the body, trying to fit all that they are back into this is so incredibly hard. So when I say biofield, I say that is soul within the context of a body. And I'm just wondering if it's like, because both your biofield is frequently overlapping with that individual's biofield, there's some synchronization there, but then it's also that you are quite literally a piece, you have a piece of your parents inside of you. The waters of them created the waters of you. I know we can talk about DNA and stuff like that, but knowing what we know now with Veda Austin's work, Gerald Pollack's work, Eileen McCusick's work, and like how all that possibly ties together with what you're studying, it's like, it would make sense that it's much easier to tune into our feelings of our thoughts of our, loved ones, of our children or of our parents,
I believe that we are inherently light beings, and we are light beings that this is just our vessel.
Mm-hmm.
This is like it's our vehicle.
Yeah.
That's what the body is, and the body is predominantly water. I mean, if you're looking at it in terms of just at the molecule level, it's like 99% of the molecules are water. Okay, if you're looking at it, from another angle, it's like, well, 70%, is water. But the reality is, we are light beings in a water body. And I realized that coming at it from multiple angles, because I mean, to me as a scientist, you want to see that, boy, I'm going to look at it from, coming this way, and then I'll look at it coming this way, and I'll look at it coming this way. And if all of these roads just keep bringing you back to the same place, that becomes, for me, that just solidifies, for me, that I'm on the right path. Okay. Because it's not like I got there this way, but then I do this thing and it goes, no, that way. I want to see that it all is kind of
coherent.
It's coherent. It's converging on the same thing. And it really became clear to me that in order to understand, who we are, we really have to understand light and how it interacts with water.
So where has that led you now?
Well, I could tell you a lot of different things.
I love it though. So
yeah, I mean, when I think about, so do you want? I could also say, some of the other things though that tell me when I say we're light beings.
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, these autists see light beings.
Yeah.
Okay, and they describe these beings of light who guard the hill.
Wow.
And they tell me that I have light beings around me.
Wow.
And they describe the light beings as very angelic. I asked them, I said, how do one of them said to me, they said, oh, you're telepathic. You can read my mind. And and I've had a lot of people say that to me. And there've been times, there've been a lot of times when I'm just so in tune with somebody else that they go, wow, you read my mind. But I don't go out there going, hey,
Right.
But I asked this autist, I said, how is it that you can tell, who's telepathic or who's not? And she said, not all autists are telepathic. and I said, well, how do you tell which ones are? And she said, it's easy. They're the ones who have the light beings around them.
Wow.
And I thought, that's very, very interesting.
That is.
And I said, I thought about it for a second, and I said, I thought, if it makes sense, this is me now leaving science, just going into, more of a, looking at the metaphysical side of this, because, the deeper you go into this, the more it brings you into the metaphysics. And I thought, if you think about these children's ability to access information, they are so porous that they need protection. I need protection.
Yeah.
For different reasons.
Mm.
And so it makes total sense.
Mm.
You have these light beings, they describe it the hill. It's part of it becomes a place that's safe for them. Because it's casting out so much light that the shadow can't appear.
Mm.
I also do a lot of work with indigenous people, and I've been working with someone who's going to be at Contact in the Desert, where I'm going to be speaking in a week or so, actually 2 weeks, and when I asked him, after I'd heard about these children seeing, blue beings of light, and then I have another woman I know who works with children who have had near-death experiences, and a lot of them have these abilities as well as a result of their near-death experience, and they can see blue light beings, and so this colleague of mine, I said, do you ever, because he has his own gifts, and I said to him, do you ever see light beings, blue light beings? And he goes, oh, that's so funny you mentioned that. He said, well, I'm going to give you a reference to, there's a book that I have that was written by someone who had studied the Chumash, which is the tribe that he's the spiritual leader of. And in it, this elder from over 100 years ago, she described these blue light beings and basically described that when people leave their body, they become a blue light being, and they can be an orb, or they can be kind of more of a humanoid. They can
Wow.
transform from like an orb to like a humanoid form. Okay. And so I think that what you want to call it, the soul, whatever you want to call
Right.
it, that we're light beings inhabiting water.
Mm.
And then when we drop this body, we go back to just being pure light.
Mm. Wow, wow, wow. So incredible, because my son has said so many things, like being able to see energy floaters, that's what he calls them, like orbs, and my daughter has seen some things too, and it's just, given what we witnessed this weekend with 7, 8, I think it was, children, all activated to have vision while totally blindfolded, solving Rubik's cubes and things like this. I'll save all that for a conversation I'm going to have next episode with Dr. Edith, but you just really do wonder if like so much of this is conditioned out of us as kids in many ways. Some of these abilities are innate, and like, I think back to this book my wife read called Mutant Messages from Down Under.
Oh yeah, I read that many years ago.
Right, that they talk about how this is about the Aboriginal people in Australia, and they talk about how like telepathy is innate to them. Like that's how they communicate. That's their primary way of communicating with each other. And it just, I feel like we're on the quest to remember that for all of us. And like, that's why your work is so incredibly important, because I'm sure like these autists, correct me if I'm wrong on this, like obviously they are incredibly gifted. But from my understanding, like many of them will say, we're here to like remind mankind who they truly are. Would you agree with that? Would they agree with that?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would agree. And it's also, it's not just to remind us of who we are, but, one of the things that this one woman who works with children, she herself has had multiple near-death experiences beginning when she was a child. Um, and she's experienced a healing, from blue light being. And in there's a book, Space Age Indians, in which this anthropologist from she's a professor emeritus from a university in Montana, and she describes, she has taken thousands of accounts from indigenous people who describe their interaction with non-human intelligence, okay? And many of them have had experience with these blue light beings where they were literally about in a very dangerous situation where they were about to die or be killed, and they're rescued by a blue light being. And so one of the things that this woman has told me, who's had that kind of experience with blue light beings, she is in touch with the souls of the children yet to be born. And she says they're terrified of being born right now, some of them.
Wow.
Because think about where we're at right now.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of these children, it's not just about reminding us what we're capable of. It's for the future generations to help us to
turn the ship around, for lack of better word.
Whatever. Turn the ship around. Just make it so that they can enter in and not be in fear. So the ones who are here now are so brave.
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
I mean, it makes me want to cry. They are so brave to come here now to take on what they've taken on, to try to get humanity to wake up and to make it so that we can, just be more fertile ground.
Yeah.
For a much more evolved, consciousness, a much more, where we're better stewards of the planet, where we're loving to one another. I mean, look at how much hate and violence and all of these things are in the world right now, and people, all these nuclear weapons. I mean, it's absolute insanity.
Yeah.
Because just reminding us who we are, it's not just about us as individuals. It's about the entire collective.
Well, that's what I mean it to.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, that's what I mean it like.
I just wanted to expand upon it because I can get, I don't mean to get preachy.
No, I love it. I love it. Please do. If I may, this might be the most appropriate time for me to share my thoughts on what might be occurring. And I've thought about this so much ever since I first heard you on Telepathy Tapes, and I ran it by a few other people whom I really respect, and you met a few of them this last weekend. They're like, "Oh, that may be what's going on. That sounds like it could be what's happening." And what you just said about the souls that are entering now are so afraid to enter, or they are aware that they're getting into some messiness, for lack of a better term, regarding this point in mankind's history. And I think because of that, the souls that are entering are incredibly gifted, I would imagine, already. And because they're incredibly gifted, from my perspective, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. A lot of those that are incredibly gifted when it comes to like being spiritually gifted, right, are also incredibly sensitive. I think you kind of already said that as well. And because mankind has put itself in a position to go so far off course with nature, let's say, don't get me wrong, like I'm communicating this message, having this conversation with you, we're putting this out to the world, and we're going to access this through technology that was created by man. Man can create very beautiful things that are useful, that can help, propel an individual forward or propel a collective forward, right? But with that being said, there are so many things that we've created that are incredibly harmful. And I think that modern life, in a variety of ways, has put us so far off course from who and what we truly are and what mankind should be doing. And because of that, because of the various toxicities in our environment, it can become so overwhelming for an incredibly gifted, sensitive soul to enter into a body that is inundated with that much toxicity. And this is just my idea, and you can be like, no, when I finish this. Because of that, it's like they don't, again, words will fail to describe this. It's like they don't fully enter into the body. And because of that, because it's too overwhelming for them. It's too overwhelming to even try to figure out how to use the body because it's inundated with the toxicity, that like all of it, right? And because of that, because they don't fully enter in, both as an adaptation and a natural response to just being too overwhelmed with that, they're able to more easily access the fullness of, again, biofield is, as I say, the soul within the context of a body. They're able to more easily access the breadth of that in ways that we aren't able to because, again, the adaptation, and also as a natural response to all that we truly are as individuated aspects of the whole, not fully seating itself within the physical body. So because of that, they're able to access some of these things instantaneously that you and I are not. And I have nothing to back that up, literally zero things to back that up, but that's kind of what I've thought may be occurring. I'd love to hear what you say. And again, if it's no, then that's totally fine.
Yeah, no, I mean, we're basically on the same page in the sense that, I always go back to, like kind of first principles, trying to understand, what, what do, for example, going back to, what do all these people that are incredibly psychic seem to have in common? Why is it that you have people who were severely traumatized as a child? Okay, have some of these, psychic abilities. People who've had a near-death experience, psychic abilities. People who are autistic. What is it? And getting beyond just the left brain, right brain. Okay, what I realized is that what they share in common is that they had an experience when they exited the body. And so, that's a major component of a near-death experience. Is to just like, I was dead, and I, was floating on the ceiling, and I looked down, and I saw this lifeless, inanimate thing that I thought was me, and I'm here, and then the CPR's performed or whatever, and they're back in the body, and like, and
Right.
but it's like once you've cracked that nut open, or severe trauma when a child is real little, little children are better able to disassociate, and so severe pain can make you zip, because it's just like, it's too painful to be here, and your consciousness still has it knows that you're not your body when you're real little. So you haven't really bought into that programming that this is who I am, and then when this is gone, I no longer exist. And so, and then you have people like Robert Monroe, who and Ingo Swann, who would do astral projection. They would voluntarily evoke an out-of-body experience. You have people, at the Monroe Institute who use binaural beats, to get their brain into the frequency that enables an out-of-body experience. So I agree. I think of it in terms of that once you are, you exit that embodied experience, then where does that consciousness even go? I think it's still within your biofield. It's within your consciousness field.
Yeah.
And so I thought about that, and then I read this, but I didn't connect it with autism yet until I read this book by this Japanese boy who wrote a book, The Reason I Jump. And he says in that, when asked, why do you jump? He says, I jump because it feels like my soul is detaching from my body.
Wow.
And when I read that, I was like, bingo. And then I was on a Zoom call with this boy who was non-speaking autistic. And I just asked the question for the first time, do you ever feel like you're not in your body? And he lit up and he's like, all the time. And the mother's like, I didn't know that.
Wow.
And I thought it makes sense that, because they have so many issues with what's called proprioception. And proprioception is that sense of where your body is in space. And it's part of why they have such difficulty using their body, because you have to know where your body is to use it. And so, they're and then a lot of them are just traumatized too, So, there's multiple reasons, you don't have to evoke toxicities or, there's just multiple reasons why they don't have that embodied experience.
Yeah.
And I think that, I like the simulation theory, which is something that a lot of mainstream scientists and philosophers say, is a legitimate way of trying to understand these things. To think of ourselves as just, this is our avatar. I just adopt this identity for now, but this isn't who I am. This is just the avatar I took on so that I can be within this sort of simulation, interacting with other people, and it means that not everybody you're interacting with is even another player.
Yeah, okay? Like the NPC idea.
Yeah, exactly. And so. But why are we doing this? Why are we incarnating in these bodies, taking on these avatars? It's so that we can get better and better and better at what we call the game of life, so that we can evolve our consciousness. We are different. We take on the body so that we can differentiate consciousness, which is unified in its, by nature, consciousness is unified. But just like the rainbow takes, the prism takes white light and differentiates it into colors so that we can even see anything. Because if we didn't have colors, then we wouldn't see anything. Similarly, with consciousness, for consciousness to evolve and explore itself, it has to differentiate and then interact. And so that's how I would describe it.
Wow. What do the autists say is the purpose of life, if you've ever asked them that?
I haven't really asked them the purpose of life,
I'd be so interested in know what they say.
Yeah. I haven't really asked them that. I think because I already kind of know where they're coming from. I think, the thing is that we need to ask these big questions, okay? But we need to ask these big questions as they apply to us as an individual. There's some things we need to personalize, because what's more important than just what the purpose of life is in general. I think the purpose of, does there have to be a purpose to life as in the life itself? Can it just exist? It's like, so that's why I say bring it more into the personal. What's the purpose of my life? Why am I here? And, what am I here to do? And it's our job to figure that out. Don't let other people tell you that.
I love that so much. Wow, I love that so much. What do they say about God? Because I know in one of the episodes of the Telepathy tapes, I think it was in episode 7, and I think the kid's name was Houston, talks about how at night, like, he becomes overwhelmed sometimes because he's hearing from God so much. Other than him, what have some of the other kids said about God? And what I'm getting at here is, like, you've also studied just like psychic phenomena for a long time, even outside of the realm of telepathy, like so many different things, and studied consciousness for quite some time. I've come to the conclusion that I've come to the belief that we live in a pantheist and a panentheist realm. It's both. That there paradoxically is a distinct, all-knowing, omniscient, omnipresent, omnibenevolent creator of this experience that is distinct from us. But then also on the flip side of that, we are also fundamentally a part of that creator, to where I really struggle with saying like, oh, I am God at my core, because I don't think I am God, but I am inextricably linked to God, right? Yeah, so I would just be interested to know what they have said about God.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things, so these things get so filtered by language once again.
I know.
I mean, and Houston's mother is a fundamentalist Christian,
Right.
and so when he says God, I don't know how much is like. He hears that word gets put onto something.
Or he's using the language that his mother can relate to.
He's using the language that think of it in terms of, so to me, God is, like you described, God is, omniscient and omnipresent and all powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, God is that unity consciousness.
Agree.
That is primary and fundamental.
Agree.
And so when we differentiate into, we take on this avatar, and we're sort of, and and we're differentiating, we have within us part of that unity consciousness that, due to the fractal holographic nature of reality, contains the whole. I mean, that each part contains the whole, but it is not the whole. And so, for example, when people have a near-death experience and they experience some energy that is all loving and benevolent, if they're Buddhist, it's Buddha. If they're Christians, it's Jesus, or God, or Mother Mary, but it's going to that image gets put onto it because it's easier for us to conceptualize something, because we need to put an image on it. We need to put words on it. But all of these things cannot have an image or words put to it, because that granulizes it. It detracts from the very thing that it is.
So well said. So well said.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, man. I feel myself in this conversation. I'm very mindful of it, right? Like going into like analytical thought, coming down. Like I can literally feel like a weight there. You know what I mean? Like when I am in there, when I'm in my heart and I'm like really thinking, for lack of a better term, thinking from there, right? Like perceiving from there, filtering reality from there, versus in my mind, back down to my heart. And like what you just said there was whoosh, like immediate drop into here again.
Right.
Which is inherently something that can't be described with words, because you referred back to something in a very eloquent way, but behind the words, underneath the words, was this right? Like it's one of those moments, like when you reflect on the idea that like God has existed forever, right? Like it has always been, and like really, really reflect on that. It gives you like a feeling of just incredible awe and wonder and all of it. Again, words can't describe it, like deep, deep, deep within here. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
It's like a recognition of that's inside of both of us, and like that's who we truly are. It's like it's referential. It's referring back to who and what we truly are at our core.
And I want, what people need is to reconnect with that. That's what people desperately need. They don't need the words. Words take us away from that.
Yes. All right, I'm going to transition this as best I can. Like, where are you? But I mean, there's so many other things that I want to get into. You mentioned when we were off recording, off mic, that there is a lot that you have learned that has just been incredible from verbal autistic kids related to things like this. So could you share anything of those that are top of heart, let's say?
Well, and they're not necessarily even kids, it can be adults. And so it's really been from neurodivergent adults, many of whom themselves have an autistic kid. But they then, after their child was diagnosed as being autistic, they started thinking, well, maybe I am too, but it just isn't as obvious in them. I mean, and one of the examples of that are there's this woman who lives in Tennessee who sent me this image. And she said, it was just like right out of the blue. I hadn't heard from her for months and months and months and months. And she sent me this image. She said, I'm getting downloaded with stuff. And she said, I need to send you this image. And I look at it, and it is a carving on a stone in Scotland. The Picts, Picts. And I have some, Scottish, Irish, Celtic, background. And the next day, and I'm looking at the symbol going, because I'm really interested in symbols. The ancient people knew so much that it's been hidden from us. It's been obscured. And the more I dive into these cultures, the more I realize how much they understood, and we really need to open that up, and so anyway, so I was interested in this image and really paying attention to it, and then the next day, this woman who similarly is neurodivergent, she lives in England, and she sends me the same image.
Wow.
And I'm looking at this image, and I said to her, do you know what this is? She said, my intuition is that it's a portal. She has these dreams at night where she's seeing these symbols, and she's trying to sort them out. And she's trying to, I think what's happening is that, now this, once again, I'm getting into my more metaphysical concept, but I really think that she's getting information from the from ancestral knowledge. And part of why I say that is that the night before the first woman sent me that image, I went to this woman was giving a demonstration of this process that she does to help people to work through their just have breakthroughs, and she and what she does is it's sort of like psychodrama, but not really. And what I mean by that is, in psychodrama, you'll have people take on the role. Let's say you had issues with one of your parents, and so ask somebody from the audience to come and, after hearing a little bit of your story, adopt the posture, say the kind of things.
Family constellations.
Family constellation work. That's right. And so it's sort of like that, only it's more than that, because what it is it's like you don't even have to say something to have the information come through.
Mm-hmm.
You may not even think that information came through. In other words, it may be that she just sets you up and says, okay, you're the father and you're the grandmother, and this is, this other individual. And she just assigns those roles, and people just feel it. Okay. It's just like, you just take it on. Okay.
Yeah.
You just take it on. It's like, you don't even have to think about what you have to say. Just feel the energy of that.
Yeah.
Okay. And what happens is over the next day or 2 or 3 or 4, the individual that it's being done for gets the information, takes on the healing.
Yes. I've done family constellations, and it is incredibly profound. And to your point, like, you don't necessarily need to have that just by them, like, taking the posture of intending to take on the energy of, whatever that needs to be healed. Let's say it's like a son to mother, right? That's what it was in my case. Just the posturing of that and the intention of that is incredibly profound. I will say, though, what was wild is the lady who was doing it was, without any possible knowledge of who my mother is, saying specific words that my mom would say with no possible knowledge of it.
Right. Yeah, it's whether you want to call that channeling,
right.
or, whatever you want to call that.
Yeah.
Okay. And so the exercise that she had people do was, she asked me, she said, what is it that you want? And I'm a psychiatrist, psychotherapist, for 40 years. I was a therapist. I mean, so it's not like I have all these unresolved things that I'm trying to work through. I'm good.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm like, well, I'm not trying to work through anything with any of them. But I thought, what do I really want? I'd love to connect with my ancestors. I want to know, what do my ancestors want to tell me? And so she did this exercise where one person was your ancestors' bones. Okay. And then another person played me. Okay. And it was one of those things where it's like, if the bones could speak to you, okay, what would this bones say to you? And I know from my work with indigenous people that they believe that you got to treat the bones of your ancestors with absolute respect.
Wow.
That's why they get so upset if you go onto their land where their ancestors are buried and start, doing it as like, oh, this is a treasure trove. Look at what I found here. Oh, here's this, wow, I bet I could sell this on eBay for whatever. They're very protective of it. They're not protective. They're not protective of it for reasons that are irrational. It's their spiritual understanding of how things work.
Yeah.
And that's why they get so upset. And so that's what I wanted to know. What do my ancestors have to say to me? My ancestors, at least in this country, were the founders of this country.
Mm.
And came over on the Mayflower, came over, so some of them came over on the Mayflower. Some came over, John Winthrop, the first governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, was my 8th great-grandmother's uncle.
Wow.
My ancestors left behind the life they had, their money, they had positions in society. They left it behind because they were pilgrims. They were spiritual seekers who didn't like the corruption that had occurred within England. And so they left for spiritual freedom. So and it's just in my DNA to be somebody, to be who I am, even without having known them. But I want to know, what were my ancestors, what guidance would they give me? And so that it does this, ceremony with the ancestral bones and, and somebody, it's like the answer, somebody's me. Well, it's the next day that I get this from out of the blue, this autistic woman sends me this picture. And then this other woman in England sends me the same frigging stone. And I'm told by her, she says, my intuition tells me this is a portal.
Wild.
It gets even better because, so I have a conversation with this woman in England, and I said, well, tell me what's behind you sending me, this image or whatever. And she said, it just came to me to send to you. And she said, I had my, DNA studied by, I don't remember if it was Ancestral.com or 23andMe, one of those, Anyway, and she said, and I discovered that I am related to, if not a descendant of this woman who was sacrificed on a volcano, an extinct volcano in South America, in Peru. And she's now in a museum in Mexico, which, that's horrible to, to have your, an ancestor, But anyway, but if you study the culture of the the Aztec, if you study, they would do human sacrifice as a way of appeasing the gods, and it was actually considered a tremendous honor to be chosen, and they would choose the individuals who were considered to be the most pure or whatever.
Right.
And they would, give them special food, a certain special diet. Okay, like very, no meat or whatever.
Right.
Just give them a very special diet and in preparation for their sacrifice. And she says that to me, and I said, well, that's really interesting that you say that to me, because a couple of years ago. And this just happened, 6 months ago or so.
Oh, really? This is recent.
A couple of years ago, I went to Ireland for the first time in search of my roots. And my name, my birth name, Hennacy, means descendant of Angus, who is the Celtic god of love and poetry. And I went to, in Ireland, they can tell what part of Ireland you're from. It's clans, just like the Scots have, the clans. They could tell what part of Ireland you're from by your name. And when I would tell people who were Irish, because I've met a number of people from Ireland over the years, they'd say, oh, I knew exactly where you come from. Hennessy, that means, it's Angusa, descendant of Angus, and so So I went to Ireland to try to find my roots, and the records in Ireland don't exist going back very far at all. They were burnt down or somehow lost. And my ancestors came over from Ireland long enough ago that that there's no records in Ireland that could help me. Okay. And so I was like, okay, well, that's a bust. But I went to the part of Ireland where my ancestors lived, and there is a hill called Croghan Hill. Okay. And Croghan Hill is an extinct volcano. And my boyfriend and I climbed up to the top of the hill, and that hill was visited by St. Bridget and St. Patrick. And at the top of it, there's a statue, there's a stone, same shape stone, only a modern stylized side of it, like the stone that this carving of the portal was on. And carved on one side is an image of the volcano exploding. On another side is an image of St. Bridget. And on another side is this like Native American looking woman.
Wild.
And below it is a cemetery. And this is the location where they found the bogman who was preserved because of the bog.
Mm-hmm.
He was preserved, and he's from, I think they think he's, I don't know, 1,500 years old or something,
Yeah.
And he was a king who was sacrificed. That's how he was killed. He was sacrificed, similar to this woman's ancestors in South America.
Mm-hmm.
Also on an extinct volcano.
Wild.
Also in a museum, only mine is in a museum in Ireland.
Yeah.
So here we find that we have this connection, all happening as a result of, well, synchronous with.
Right.
Synchronous with doing that little ritual or whatever, and me asking to connect with my ancestors.
That's wild.
I can't. That is so. You can imagine how moving that was for me. So that's really hard to top.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. I mean, it's because it's so personal for you, and like there was your answer right there, like to connect with your ancestors. Oh my goodness. What's up, you guys? I'm here with Matt Maruka, the founder of Raw Optics, to talk about something that I would say the overwhelming majority of people in the holistic health community totally overlook: light and circadian rhythm health.
All of our cells contain these organelles called mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell. They make energy, they convert food into useful chemical energy. And it turns out mitochondria are largely controlled by our circadian rhythm. Our mitochondria are more active during the day under the influence of sunlight. When the sun goes away, our mitochondria have the opportunity to rest, repair, and regenerate when we're not being active. When it gets dark, the brain releases melatonin, and melatonin goes in and actually repairs the mitochondria, repairs all the oxidative damage that happens. Now, if we're exposed to blue light from all the artificial light sources, your phone, your iPad, your computer, your TV, the lead scientist we work with, Dr. Alexander Wunsch from Germany, actually calls it light doping. So people today are sort of being light doped by their employers with artificial blue enriched lighting to increase their productivity at the expense of their health, mental health, and long-term health and well-being. And so just by being exposed to artificial light at night can actually have a massive effect on the body's rhythm, cellular repair, and overall health and function. So we designed lenses that specifically block these disruptive wavelengths of light So that's why we created daylight lenses. They protect your eyes from the physical damage of short wavelength blue light, but also offer a bit of a protective and relaxing effect for your hormonal system as well, but not to the degree of the sunset lenses, which are designed to basically make you really tired and even kind of knock you out in the evening. So these are the two lenses we offer so that you can have protection at the right levels, in the right way, at the right time. And then sunset lenses, you wear these 2-3 hours before bed, or just from the sunset until sleep, so that your brain can register, okay, the sunset, it's time for me to release that melatonin naturally so I can wind down and not have to use alcohol, weed, sleeping pills, and other things that so many people unfortunately have become dependent on because we're constantly disrupting our body's release of its natural sleep hormone.
So if you want to take control of your light and optimize your biology, head to the show notes or go to rawoptics.com and use code TWF10 at checkout for 10% off.
One of the most like profound things for me, and I know we already visited this a little bit and sort of moved beyond it, but it's just so profound, is Akil, one of the Akils, and the shared consciousness that he had with his mom. I guess the first question I want to ask with that is like, I know we talked about how it seems much easier to do it with like between family members, right? But you've had people literally read your mind that you've been around. And I guess let's just start with Akil and like tell me some of the most incredible things you witnessed with respect to him and his mom.
Well, I mean, the thing that I've seen is, him reading his mother's mind. I mean, just
no matter how far away he is from her.
Well, I wouldn't say, well, he can be, I haven't done it so that I see him like, on another side of the city or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I've never had him outside of the house with her, but she says that she was able to even do it with him when she was in India and he was still in the States, so distance doesn't seem to apply, but I think that what my research suggests, and I really need to do more research, is that 100%, like, just,
nailing it every time.
10-digit number, 100% accurate. I mean, that is more likely to happen if they're in the same general space, as though like having their consciousness fields overlapping with one another, it plays a role in that. Mm-hmm. Whereas the kind that occurs like from far away it's got to be more important than a 10-digit number.
Yeah.
It's more meaningful than that. And it may be that there's more than one process involved here. It may be that, being in the same space, it's just that it's just easy peasy, it's right. Like his consciousness and her consciousness are overlapping, whereas that there's still a connection between them when they're far apart. But it just is...
It's more like when you're right next to someone, it's quite literally that your field is interacting with their biofield versus when they're far away, you're having to, via whatever mechanism relative to that individual that you can, project your essence through the ether and attach it and link it to that individual's essence in order to draw and transmit and receive information.
And part of how that happens, though, is like when Manisha was doing that from India with Akil, she was on her phone with him. Yeah. So so I think that helps to establish the connection.
Wow.
Just like, Eileen McCusick talks about how she can do remote, tuning of your biofield. Yeah. But she's not doing it without having the Zoom call.
Right.
So I see it as that.
Yeah. Or like, that's, oh my gosh, that's such a good point. I mean, and using the phones as an analogy is actually great because it's the difference between like, if you use AirDrop with iPhones, right? Like iPhones set them right next to each other, they can like transmit information pretty quickly versus having to send a very, very, very long video really far away, right? It's sort of the same, possibly the same mechanism, just far inferior, I would say, with the iPhones from the technology that I believe is innate to us.
Mm-hmm.
You know? Mm-hmm. The other thing that I want to get into a little bit is the precognition, because there's this moment in telepathy tapes where I believe it's Houston is talking about how he is a little bit agitated or upset because he lets his mom know that there's going to be a shooting 3 days from now, and he just learned about it. And sure enough, 3 days later, there was a school shooting or something like that in Florida. No, there was a school shooting. I just don't remember exactly where. What other examples of precognition have you seen that are just like, aside from your own life experience of like, hey, you're going to go to San Diego and and all that, have you experienced that is just like so incredibly profound?
Well, I mean, so another example of that would be there was this woman that I worked with when I was in San Diego who was autistic, but she was, once again, somebody who could speak. And she had been severely traumatized as a child. And I was the only person that she trusted. I had really helped her a lot. And one day I went to the beach with some friends of mine for a picnic and got into this conversation with my friends where they said, I was starting to talk about, whether or not, I was with my boyfriend then, and he was like, I don't think I could live where you live because I need to be on more land. And I'm like, well, I don't know that I could afford more land in San Diego. It's really expensive. Mm-hmm. And so my friend said, well, what do you think about, checking out Oregon? Because, our friend Taffy had just moved up there and she loves it. And, why don't we just go visit her and check it out? I thought, okay, well, we can go to Oregon and go check it out. Well, as we're walking back from the beach, my phone rings and it's this autistic woman calling me in a panic. And she says, Dr. Powell, she goes, I just got this fear that you're going to move away from San Diego. And at the time I had no, I was like, wow, I was like, and that my friend's granddaughter was with us and she's going, that's spooky. Yeah. She's like, what? And I just like, I was like, well, I was like, well, don't, I was just like, I'd sort of reassured her because at that point I really wasn't intending to move away. Mm-hmm. I was just sort of, I thought it'd be fun to go visit my friend Taffy anyway, and mm-hmm. I just thought, and it was interesting that because Peggy was like, she's like, there's no way I'd move away from San Diego, but if I were to ever move anywhere, it'd be where Taffy is, I'm going to mm-hmm. just go check it out. So it really wasn't with the intention that, and so then the thing is that within 6 months of that, I ended up going into escrow in a house in Oregon and moving away.
Mm. That's wild.
And so it was that she was not only bonded with me, that she knew what was going on. She knew
what was going on right then.
Knowing what's going on right then, but she also added to that,
right?
What was going to be the outcome.
Yeah.
And it reminded me of the person that I saw at Harvard who said things that were like ongoing, yeah, your husband's applying for jobs in, 2 different cities. But then she also predicted where I was going to end up as well. And so it really does make you, think about time and how we conceptualize time.
And also free will, though. For me,
and
at
free
least.
will,
like,
yeah. I talk about this.
Goes.
I talk about this in my book, the ESP Enigma. Because these are things I wrote that book, 18 years ago, and yet it's still as relevant today, if not more so.
Well, I'll throw it in the show notes for people who want to read it.
So I talk in that book about, I don't tell that story that I just told you, but I talk in that book about, something called future memory, mm-hmm. and so future memory is something that Phyllis Atwater has studied, and she's somebody who's best known for her work on near-death experiences. She herself has had multiple near-death experiences. And there's something about having had a near-death experience that can predispose some people to something that she calls future memory. And by future memory, what she describes is that you are, it's more than just deja vu. Okay, this sense of, oh, I've been here before, or whatever. What it is what she will have, all of a sudden, she'll have this sort of change in her visual field. Okay, sort of like seeing like these scintillating, light. Okay, almost as though the screen is changing. The screen is shifting, and then she'll be somewhere in the future, and have an experience that, like dreams, is compressed. Okay, because it may be that in, this, sort of waking reality, only, a minute or two passes, but the amount of time it would take for that event in the future to occur over is, maybe an hour or something.
Right.
And so that's what I mean by it's compressed.
Right. Got it.
And so she would have these experiences, and then what would happen is sometime down the road, she wouldn't know when it was. It might be a few days later, it might be a year later. She'll be in that situation. She's like, this is the beginning of that image, that little movie that I saw before, and she'll know exactly what's going to happen next. She knows exactly what people are going to say. She knows exactly who's going to walk in the door, et cetera, et cetera. And so she calls it future memory because it has the same kind of feeling as a memory.
Mm-hmm.
It only in many ways it's got it's better than a memory because a lot of us don't have so detailed, kind of reliving memory. So almost like how people describe flashbacks, where it's like a reliving.
Yeah.
Okay, only this is a pre-living.
Mm-hmm.
And in her work, what she said is that sometimes what happens is that the individual who has future memory can use the fact that they recognize it for what it is to prevent something bad happening. So she tells the story of this person who's at a street corner and getting ready to cross the street and recognizes, wait a minute, this is that street corner, this is that girl in the blue dress, and this is this. And in the future memory was hit by a car. And because of having the experience of, wait a minute, this is that future, doesn't step off the curve when she was about to, and then that car, the very car that she had seen in her future memory hit her, goes by. And yet, she gives other stories in which somebody sees it, doesn't want it to happen, and they can't prevent it.
Wow. See, the first would imply free will. This one doesn't, though.
Exactly. And so I think you can't, there's some things that are going to happen no matter what, however you want to conceptualize that this is part of your karma, that this is what you need to have happen because of then what happens as a result of that.
Yeah.
And then there are other things that it's like, okay, this doesn't have to happen that way. It's like a choice point.
A choice point, yeah. Makes sense.
And so free will exists, but
you're in a dance.
But you're in a dance, and not everything is under your control of free will. So I do believe in this sort of block. The concept of the universe, is like a block universe where space time, it's really it exists.
Got it. Okay.
So
Like past, present, and future exist all at
past,
once.
present, and future all coexist, but it's dynamic.
Yeah.
It's not set in stone, but some pieces, lots of it are set. There's got to be a framework, there's got to be a structure, but then there's a certain amount of play within the system.
Got it. Can we talk about a few of the the claircognizant, clairsentient, clairaudient, that you've directly witnessed or studied?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. What are some that stand out to you as examples? I know, like, asking this question off recording, you're like, honestly, like, I am so beyond like the most mind-blowing examples that it's sometimes struggle to even recall because I've seen so many mind-blowing things. But let's say on like clairsentient.
Well, yeah, I mean, each of the clairs, really has to do with just receiving information from a distance, basically, so clairsentient, that you're feeling something, you know, or clairvoyant, that you're seeing something, or clairaudient, you're hearing something that's not there. I mean, I've already given you some examples of things that are, certainly clairvoyant. I think one of the things that is important to realize is that it's not. I think we all have our strong sensory systems, and so sometimes you might have somebody who experiences something as clairsentient that for another person they'd receive that same information in a clairaudient way. In other words, get back to this woman who contacted me when I was walking away from the beach. It's like, and I didn't ask her, so I don't know which one of those clairs it was, but clearly she picked up information about me. Was it that she just felt this gut-wrenching fear,
right,
that to her was like, this is what abandonment feels like, and this is the person who, the only person that if they left, it would abandon me, and it would feel like abandonment, and that therefore that must be what this feeling is.
Or was it clairaudient that it was literally that she heard your voice in her mind?
Yeah. Did she see the future? Or it's like I didn't really, and a lot of these experiences that I've had, I haven't had the opportunity to really kind of dial it in and find out, how did you receive it? And sometimes people don't even remember how they received it. Well,
it's like my son. So I don't know if I told you this in our several conversations over the last few days, but my son walked up to my wife. We weren't trying to get pregnant. We had no concept that we might be, like, we were 10 months of not being careful necessarily, but it was 10 months. Like, there's no indication, right? And my son just walks up to my mom or to my wife in the kitchen and just nonchalantly says, "Mom, you're pregnant." And then when we ask him now how he knew, he's like, "I don't know. I have no idea how I knew." But he did somehow. He knew. Like, you can't deny it, because that was 4 days before what would have been my wife's period. So we had no concept that she was even late, anything, none of it, right? And then turns out she was pregnant, and now we have, a 6-week-old baby boy. It's like, you can't make that up, but he doesn't even know how it happened. I think, like, for so many of us, we have subtle hits or subtle moments where these abilities happen to us too. But it's like, we're not like the nonverbal autists who can seem to access them at will. But it's like, if you pay attention in your own life, if you really pay attention, there are so many moments that you may chalk up to being coincidence that aren't. That you're knowing beyond the 5 senses that mainstream science says we have. Now, I know they're moving beyond that now, but you get what I'm saying. It's like, we all have these abilities. in some way. And just like Michael Jordan has a higher capacity to jump from the free throw line, you don't have the ability to jump from the free throw line and dunk. So there might be some of us who have those abilities more than others, but we all, I think, have the capacity to do these things as human beings. And those moments show up for us in our lives in various ways if we just pay attention a little bit more and get still a little bit more and approach things with a little bit more wonder and childlike curiosity and openness. I think they show themselves to us. I think God meets us there. I think it's incredibly special when, two or more people, dare I say, are doing the same thing, because where two or more are gathered, there am I. It creates a sort of field effect where you're more open to it, But for people who are incredibly skeptical, and maybe they didn't attend Confluence where they got to witness 750 people or be amongst 750 people who are watching 7 children with blindfolds on. We're passing one around through the audience and everyone's trying on the blindfold and it's clear you cannot see anything with them on. And these kids are solving Rubik's Cubes. These kids are like saying colors. All of them are getting the colors right. People are flashing drawings that they just read, and each kid is calling out exactly what's on the drawing. It was incredible. But as I was saying, for the people who are still skeptical of that, you have, as a scientist, designed experiments, designed studies related to this. I know we referenced a few at the beginning, but what are some of the other studies that you've done, specifically with these nonverbal kids, related to some of these abilities that are just like, for you, it's undeniable?
Oh, well, I mean, just to be clear, I haven't really been able to study them for anything other than telepathy yet.
Yeah. Well, okay, examples within telepathy is what I'm saying.
Oh, wow. Okay. You mean like just what? I mean, I did research with a boy named Ramses who, at the age of 2, he could already read 8 different languages. Yeah, not just English and Spanish, but Japanese and Russian and Hebrew and Arabic and Hindi. I mean, he and it's not clear how he learned to do those. I mean, his mother spoke English and Spanish, but I mean, he wasn't, as far as we know, exposed to any of those other languages. And so I tested him for that, and he was able to do mathematics, at the age of 5. That was, high school level mathematics, and read a college level astronomy book. I mean, and I tested him for telepathy, and because he could speak, I would hear him say what the answer was. So it wasn't requiring any kind of device or, stencil board or anything for him to, point to.
So would that be in the design of these experiments with respect to telepathy, when you're talking about like you would hear him say the answer, what would that mechanism look like? So are you talking like having his mom think something and then he says the answer? Or how is that working?
Yeah. So what I would do is sometimes we'd have like a whiteboard where we're behind the whiteboard and he's on the other side of the room. Okay. And I would choose a random number and, and put it on the whiteboard, and then he'd call out the number from the other side of the room. Yeah. Or sometimes I would, take playing cards and, once again, randomize it and then show it to the mother and then say, Ramses, what card did your mother just look at?
And you'd call it out.
And he'd call it out. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Across all your studies, what would you say is like their accuracy?
I would say that they're pretty close to 100% accurate. I mean, well over 90%.
It's incredible. The last 2 questions I have is related to consciousness itself, and then like our ability to do these things as well. And for the audience's context, Diane and I just got back from Confluence yesterday, and that was 5 days and very beautiful, but also very draining. But we also have her recorded presentation for those that are members of the Way Forward. And like, I cannot stress this enough as well. Please check out Diane's book. That will also be in the show notes. Like your work, I'll say this to you rather than to them. I've already said this enough, but I can't say it enough. Your work is incredibly important, like incredibly important. And I think this is a huge gift that I get to sit down with you like this. So thank you. So the question of consciousness, like, where is it? How does it work? I don't think we have any way to say with 100% certainty how it does work. But you were bringing up in your presentation at Confluence the people, I forget the name of the condition, but it's where much of what is inside their skull is actually water, yet they still seem to have the same general functioning of a normal human being. That and so many other things would imply that it's not that matter creates mind, it must be some other way. Based on all you've studied, what have you come to understand about what that other way might be?
Yeah, I think of the brain as basically, and it's not just the brain, it's the whole body, is really our way of navigating consciousness. Consciousness is really, it's like a field of information. And what happens is that some of these individuals who are born with conditions where their brain is wired differently, like you mentioned, the people whose brain is predominantly water, it's a condition called hydrocephalus, and hydro, water, cephalus, head. And this British neurologist named Lorber, he studied 600 cases of profound hydrocephalus. Many of whom, 95% of what's in their cranium is water. So very little brain tissue, and only half of them had an IQ below normal. And some of them had superior IQs. One of them had an IQ of 130. And so then you have to ask yourself, what is it that, how is this operating? It's not, it's clearly not about the circuitry. Mm-hmm. This idea that memory and information is, contained, in the synaptic connections and their reinforcement just doesn't apply for these individuals. And I bring up the fact that they're born with this condition as important for you to understand, because if you are born with a normal brain and then you have a stroke or surgery or something that removes parts of your brain, then you will lose certain functionality. But if from the get-go you had something different, mm-hmm. then that's what you work with.
Right.
And so when I look at what would be the minimal unit then for navigating consciousness, the ventricles of the brain, the ventricles are the part of the brain that contain the ionized water. Mm-hmm. So it's not just pure water; it's water that has ions in it that mm-hmm. are kept at a very, very specific pH and concentrations. That within that cavity, lining it, you have these cells that have cilia. And cilia are the, we have cilia in our lungs. They help to move the fluid in the lungs. Yeah. Well, you have cilia that are lining the ventricles. And within those cilia are these structures that contain microtubules. And microtubules are superconductors. They're made up of these proteins that are magnetic dipoles. And so what they're doing is, I believe, they're reading the biofield's information, the toroidal biofield's information as it passes through the ionized water.
Now we're talking. That's exactly how I think it works. And like, that's why when I called you about confluence the first time, and I brought up, other people are coming, Dr. Gerald Pollack, Veda hadn't said yes at this time, but she did, thank goodness. And I brought up Gerald Pollack and Eileen McCusick. And I don't want to speak for you, but you were just elated because you're like, all of my work is pointing back to the biofield in water. And as I was listening to telepathy tapes, that's all I could think about the entire time was the biofield, water, and ether, I'll say, for me. So it's incredible that, like, it's still trying to figure out exactly how it all works, as I'm sure you are too, but it's all pointing in that direction. Last thing I'll say, or I'll ask is, and I know, again, I'm so grateful for your time, and I know you're incredibly tired. So I'll make this the last one. I'm sure you get this all the time. Okay, these nonverbal autistic kids and these other individuals have these abilities accessed. What can I do to hone in on my abilities to do these things as well?
Well, there are a lot of things you could do. Yeah. Well, I think so much of it is really your state of consciousness. A lot of people, when they're trying to teach somebody how to access information, what they're really trying to teach them is breath. Pay attention to your breathing and how you constrict the flow of if you constrict your breath, you're constricting the flow of the biofield and of, your cerebrospinal fluid. So you need to really be paying attention to that and circulating things. You also have to pay attention to your thoughts, because if you go into analytical mode, thinking in terms of words, you're keeping the left hemisphere active, and you're getting away from really the information that's the knowing information, and you're going into the sort of analytical overlay and trying to extract the information from the ways that you were told to do that.
Yeah.
And so it's a bad habit.
Like through empiricism and rationalism rather than knowing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's crazy because it all comes back to like breath, and breath is like the primary thing that we need. I have so many other thoughts, but we'll do a part 2. It's okay. When your next book comes out. I want you to plug your book, please, and anything you have working on as we're closing up here. Thank you so much for being here, Diane.
Yeah, thank you. You're welcome. Yeah, so if people want a copy of my book, The ESP Enigma, it's available through my website.
All that's in the show notes.
Yeah, and so drhennessy.com. And my next book, you can give me your name. I'm going to be, when it's ready for pre-order, then we'll let you know so you can pre-order it. And the tentative title for it is Wired for the Impossible. And I think we're all wired for the impossible.
Amen. Thank you so much for being here, Diane.
You're welcome. Thank you.